Hi, I'm Melanie from Color Caboose Creations, and today we're going to see if we could take this simple cabinet and turn it into this wonderful land and sky cabinet from Anthropologie. Today's video is a dupe challenge hosted by Clara from over at No Can Do. She challenged us to find a high-end piece of furniture and recreate the look on a budget. If you haven't already checked out her channel, this is something that she is excellent at. She is all about recycling and reducing your carbon footprint by using things that are already out there. I highly recommend checking out this video she did recently on the popular Easy Off oven cleaner hack. She dissects the chemical compounds and really makes you think about if this is something you want to attempt. The piece that I chose for this challenge was the beautiful Land and Sky cabinet from Anthropologie. This cabinet currently retails on the website for just under $2,000. It's something that I've had saved in my Pinterest folder for a very long time. I fell in love with the cute little fox curled up in the middle, surrounded by what looks to be embossed or carved flowers, ferns, and I believe that they are moths. They don't really look like butterflies. This cabinet is flat on all sides and features just some very simple mid-century style legs. Now the cabinet that I'm going to be attempting to recreate this look on is something I got for free. It's this one. And the reason why I chose this cabinet is because of those double doors. The doors are slightly inset in relation to the frame, and although it's not exactly like the Anthro cabinet, I figure with a few minor tweaks and adjustments, it would be a really great starting point. I will briefly kind of show you what I did to modify this cabinet before I continued on with the rest of the makeover. I won't go into detail because it's really going to depend on what's available in your area, what kind of adjustments you need to make. Here are a few examples of pieces that I think would work. Just doing a quick marketplace search in my area, I came across many of these microwave carts ranging between $10 to $20. The excess parts would just need to be trimmed off and they would be an excellent candidate. I also came across a TV stand, and check out this entertainment center for free. Notice the double doors down at the bottom. If you had someone trim off the excess, it would be perfect. Now looking at my cabinet, I had a border that extended about ½ inch from the base of the doors, which definitely needed to get trimmed off. If you look down at the bottom, I also had a little bit of a stand attached to this cabinet, which I had to leave, and then underneath an area where I was going to have to apply some wood for legs. First thing I did was remove the pulls. They happen to be solid walnut and very cool, so I will be saving those for something else. I then trimmed off that raised lip with my jigsaw. As you can see, the bottom base kind of sits a little deeper than the door faces, so I added a little bit of wood just to make everything the same height. And then I installed some tap enclosures for the doors. I just replaced the original magnets with these tap enclosures in the exact same spot, and even reused the metal tabs that were on the back of the doors, and it worked out perfect. As for that exposed lip that I had to trim off, I put a little bit of edge banding along the rim to kind of protect the porosity of that particle board. It worked out great. After that, I sanded everything down lightly and gave it a good cleaning. Now, as for these legs, I will leave a link in my description, but I will tell you, I ordered a natural finish and this is what they sent me. Black legs. I didn't have enough time to return them and get what I actually ordered, so I ended up stripping off the finish with my carbide scraper and then sanding it off the rest of the way. It wasn't a huge deal, just a little bit of an inconvenience to have to throw in an extra step. But with that being said, the prep work was done with this piece and we could finally start painting. To give myself a blank canvas, I started off with one coat of a solid color paint. The paint I chose was Sandy Blonde in DIY Paint Brand. This is a clay-based, very thick paint, and it was the closest color I had on hand to that Anthro cabinet. Because it's so thick, some people have a hard time getting a smooth finish. What I do is I just mix in a little bit of water in a bowl with it and always use a synthetic paintbrush. After one coat of paint, you can see the coverage, it's really good. And then I was finally able to kind of envision where everything else is going to be placed. To mimic those carved detailed pieces, I decided to go with molds. I use several different kinds of molds. I do purchase all of these products with my own money. And if you would like to help support content creation in the future, please visit my Amazon wishlist. I will have a link to that, as well as a list of all the products used in this video. If you're into a lot of crafting, these molds are a great investment. They can be used with several different types of materials. For this application, I decided to go with amazing casting resin because it sets up really fast and it's able to really capture all the little fine details within the molds. This resin is a two-part product. What you do is mix equal amounts of A and B together. Once you combine them together, you want to mix them thoroughly. It is a little cloudy at first, and then when it's completely mixed, it turns clear. At that point, you want to pour it into your molds immediately. You only have a few minutes of working time before it starts to set up, so I also recommend doing this in small batches. A fun feature about this product is that as it sets, it starts to turn white, and once it's completely white, you know it's ready. The molds will still be slightly pliable when they're first set, so you want to be careful releasing them. What I like to do is flip over my mold and then just roll it onto a flat surface. Look how easily they release. Now, while they're still fresh, this is also a great time to clean up any kind of edges where you might have over poured into your mold. It's also a great time to apply your molds immediately to your surface. For just a few more minutes, your molds will be slightly pliable and you can bend them and manipulate them how you want them to look onto your surface. This is another reason I like to do it in small batches. I place my molds in a similar fashion to that of the Anthro cabinet, where all the bases of my stems of the florals and vines started at the circle where the fox will be and flared out in all different directions. After my molds were set on there, a few minutes later, I went in with a small paintbrush and cleaned up any kind of glue squeeze out. This just gives you a cleaner effect because if you leave that there to dry, it will show up underneath your paint. And this one leaf is the only part where I had to split through the cabinet doors. I should have done it while it was still soft. You can see I kind of had a hard time cutting it after the fact, but I got it done. The Anthro cabinet also featured 4 moths, one at each of the corners. Surprisingly, the only moth mold I could find was this limited edition redesigned by Primo one. It's not exactly like the Anthro cabinet, but I figured, hey, it'll work. At this point, I figured it was probably safe to try and start on the fox in the middle. Now, I had no clue how I was going to achieve this, so I went to Google and I did a lot of research and finally came up with a plan. This search eventually led me to the hardware store because I came across an art technique called bas relief, which is a form of sculpture in which the object is slightly protruded away from its background. A simple example of this would be a penny. This YouTube channel gave me more information about the subject, including tutorials and the materials in which I would need to try this technique out for myself. This particular artist uses drywall compound. To my surprise, it's fairly inexpensive. This large bucket only cost me about $7. Before I got started with the sculpture, I knew I needed to figure out some sort of way to separate it amongst the doors. I didn't want to try to cut it after the fact because these doors are fairly tight to each other. So what I came up with was using floss. I didn't know if this technique was going to work, but I figure if floss can get through, the tightness of your teeth, it should be able to get through these doors kind of sitting close to each other. So I used a paper clip, taped it onto the back of the cabinet wall, and then strung a piece of floss through the center and fished it out through the front of the doors and just kind of taped it on the top while I did my sculpture. I didn't know if this was going to work, but I figured, hey, it was better than nothing. The tools that I gathered up were this decoupage spatula, a few artist spatulas. These are just plastic paint spatulas from the dollar store. I also grabbed a couple sizes of soft synthetic paint brushes, and then this little clay tool. Now here's the funny part. I was actually nervous before starting this. I don't know why. I love challenges. I love trying new things, but I was nervous. Maybe I was out of my realm. So I lit a candle hoping it would get me more in a Zen mood, and I decided, you know what? Let's just go for it. Okay, so here's how it's looking. Can you kind of see the fox? There's his tail, and there's the tip of his tail. Here's his head, and that's his nose. I gotta build that up more. Here's his hindquarters kind of wrapped around, and his shoulder, and then his back arched up. Looking kind of similar, huh? If you look at this picture, his back is arched up just a little higher than mine is. So I think I need to add more up here. After I got the basic shape of this fox in place, I decided to try and separate the doors right away, just in case I had any kind of mistakes I would have to clean up afterwards. To my surprise, the floss worked really well. I very lightly reconnected the surface of the crack and then continued on, this time incorporating the dampened soft paint brushes and just adding slight bits of compound where necessary to kind of build and really define the features of this fox. I once again took a deep breath and just went for it when it came to the ears. This joint compound is very delicate and it takes just the softest touch, so I pretty much manipulated it mostly with just the paintbrush, and I did the best that I could. To complete this fox sculpture, I used the pointy side of that clay carving tool and just lightly scratched in hair-like markings all over the body. When I was done, I was really pleased with the way it was looking, but I still had to let it dry overnight. The next morning, something I was fearful of actually happened. My fox cracked. I had a feeling because I just used such a thick amount of that compound that once it started to dry, it would shrink up. And it did. Call it stubbornness, but I wasn't going to let this stop me. Even though after opening the doors, you can see how wet it was on the inside. I figured, well, we'll just let it dry with the doors open a few more days. In the meantime, this mold I had ordered off of Amazon finally showed up. I ordered this little fern mold because I figured all the little leaves would be perfect for filling in the smaller gaps in between the bigger molds and just make it look a lot fuller. So I applied them, and I gave this fox 2 more days to dry. So here's what it looked like 2 days later, completely dry. But you can see how deep some of those cracks actually were. I knew I needed to stabilize them in some way, so I used a little bit of wood glue and a paintbrush to really drive that glue down into those cracks. And after the glue had dried, I needed a way to kind of fill in some of those really heavy cracks, so I used some paper clay. If you've never used paper clay before, it's actually very durable and it dries hard and fast. So once everything was completely dry, I gave it a light sanding with some fine grit sandpaper, and we were finally ready to start painting. Because I was dealing with so many different types of materials, the joint compound, the resin, the paper clay, and even areas of dried glue, I knew it was in my best interest to just prime the entire surface before I started painting. I once again reached for my sandy blonde paint color, diluted slightly with just a little bit of water, and with a soft synthetic paintbrush, I worked in small amounts of paint into all the little nooks and crannies of those molds to fill in everything with color. I did 2 coats this way, making sure that the first one was completely dry before I went in with the second one. Now this paint has excellent coverage, and I could actually get away with going in with 1 thick coat and really working it in for full opacity. But what that's going to do is it's going to allow a larger amount of paint to really settle in to all the little fine details of these molds, and then they're going to be distorted. They're not going to be as sharp as they are now. So it really is better to just kind of slow down and do things properly. On my second coat of sandy blonde, I decided to dip in lightly into a darker brown paint color and blend it for a slight shadowing effect. After it dried, however, I really didn't like the way it looked, so I ended up dry brushing with sandy blonde to cover it back up. But since this is a trial and error kind of project, I thought I'd show you anyways. When everything was finally dry, I sealed it up with my favorite clear wax, this DIY clear wax. This one is hands down my favorite because it has absolutely no smell, it glides on like a dream, and it does its job very well. I use a lot of different paint brands, but anytime I'm sealing with a clear wax, I always reach for this one because it just does a great job. What I do is I apply it in circular motions, let it sit on there for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then with a microfiber cloth, I come back and gently wipe away any excess. There usually isn't much. And then I came in with some white wax. This white wax is going to just make all the detail in those molds and that sculpted fox just pop. It's going to add a really cool effect to the overall cabinet. And because I'm applying it directly after the clear wax, I'm going to have a little more workability with it. To create that look of a weathered wood finish like on the original here, I dry brushed with the white wax and a chip brush, just kind of sloppy, and then went over with a microfiber cloth immediately to kind of diffuse the lines but give just a little bit of definition. I also did the same thing on the legs. As you can see, the white wax really does a lot to soften up that harsh paint and gets it looking closer to the original. This was the final step. All I had to do was attach these legs onto the cabinet and we were finished. So here it is. Here's the final project. How did I do? Was it a fail or was it a win? I'm curious what your thoughts are. For sure, it's not an exact dupe. I think as far as the print and everything on the outside, it's pretty good, despite all the little hiccups and stuff I went through to get to this point. I did learn a lot from this project, and definitely some things that could be improved on, and I'm so stubborn, I'm sure you'll probably be seeing me revisit this sort of thing again in the future. I want to thank Clara from No Can Do for challenging us to this challenge. It really pushed me out of my limits. Thank you so much. Please don't forget to check out the rest of the videos in the playlist down below. And until next time, happy junking.